think we are live. My name is Elizabeth Odell, and I'm the reference librarian at the Brookfield Library in Brookfield, Connecticut. And we'd like to welcome you to our final One Town, One Read event. And tonight we are welcoming Ryan Lintelman, who's curator at the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian. And if you have questions during this presentation, please just drop them in the comments below the video, and I will look at those and field them, and then at the end of the talk, I will ask some of those questions to our presenter. So now I'm just going to turn it over to Ryan Lintelman for the Saga of the Ruby Slippers.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to everybody who's watching, and thanks to the library for inviting me to come here and speak with you all today. I think that this is a very unusual time to be doing anything, but I really love doing things that allow us to get together and to talk about something that matters and that's fun and that kind of unites people at this time that there's so much happening in the country to keep us apart. So thank you all for joining. I hope this will be a fun conversation. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all, so please do ask questions as we go along, and we'll try to compile those all at the end. I know that Elizabeth is working to do that so that we can really start to have a dialogue about the Ruby Slippers and really what they mean to everybody here. I'm going to start my presentation now, so I think that you will probably see some slides rather than my face, but know that I'm here. So this is titled The Saga of the Ruby Slippers. Ooh, let's take it from the top. And so you'll see what that means, and maybe some of you are more familiar with the saga part of it than others, but no matter what, it starts with the movie and with the book that you've all read, or many of you have read. But I want to talk first about who I am and where I come from, so that we're all on the same page. This is the National Museum of American History, which is on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It is one of the 19 different museums and research centers that make up the Smithsonian Institution. So we are really the largest research institution, museum institution in the world. And we are, I think, a great American treasure that everybody can come and experience for free. So if you haven't been to Washington, D.C., I hope you can make it down and come and visit all of these museums. At my museum, the American History Museum, we're really charged with exploring the American experience through the objects that help to make it. So we have many different treasures at the museum, including the original Star-Spangled Banner that was the Fort McHenry flag that flew over the port of Baltimore during the War of 1812 and inspired the national anthem. We have Abraham Lincoln's hat, where else can you see that? And we have George Washington's Continental Army uniform. That's just a few of the things that we have. But it's really a big tent kind of museum, and it deals with a lot of different ways of thinking about American history. The whole Smithsonian itself deals with everything from the Big Bang to the Big Bang Theory, which is something that I recently collected, and for my collection, some costumes from that show. And, so entertainment is just as important in my mind as anything else that we might study in American history. The things that we do for fun really say as much about us as a people, about individuals, than anything else that we do. So what I do as curator of the entertainment collection is to research, to collect, to care for all these objects that help explain American history and the American experience through entertainment. And that really for me means theater, movies, television, comedy, other forms of performance. So those things that we all get together to do. So in more practical terms, that means that sometimes I share my office with Kermit the Frog and R2-D2, two of the things you see here. These are both objects that are in our collection. And I'll digress a little bit from the Ruby Slippers just to explain a little bit more about how we interpret and use these objects that we own. Actually, the American people own, but we help to interpret. So the Kermit puppet here is actually the first Kermit. He was made by Jim Henson in 1955 when Henson was a student at the University of Maryland. And he wanted to work in television. This was his dream. And he got an opportunity to work on a puppet show at the local NBC affiliate. So having never worked with puppets before, he thought, okay, this is my chance to work in the great new medium of the moment, television, in 1955, right? I mean, an 18-year-old kid got this opportunity. It's like, being having a chance to be a successful YouTuber or something like that at that moment. So he was really excited to do this and decided, okay, I'm gonna make some puppets. I'm gonna figure out what to do. So he found stuff around the house. You know, his mom had a green wool coat. He had a pair of jeans. He found a ping pong ball that he cut in half to be the eyes. And he created this puppet, which, you know, was one of the characters in the show he made, Sam and Friends, that was on, it was a local hit here on NBC. And then it became the sort of nationwide phenomenon. He took the Muppets elsewhere. So I think it's really a cool story about American ingenuity and about faking it until you make it. You know, if you don't know how to do something, you can figure it out. You can really, you know, dedicate yourself to something and make something of yourself. And then, you know, R2-D2 is the loyal droid from the Star Wars films, who, you know, sort of the unsung hero, actually, in many ways. He comes out to be that. This one was given to the museum by George Lucas at the end of filming The Return of the Jedi. And this is one of our fan favorites, too, at the museum. So, you know, part of what I do is try to figure out, why do these things become so iconic? What is it that in this diverse and divided country that we all can agree that Kermit is cute and represents something about us, and R2-D2 is a fun, lovable character that also has something that's characteristic about American society or about each of us. The same with Indiana Jones. You know, this is the question that I work with a lot at the museum. We collect all these costumes and props and archival material, not just because they're fun or that people like them or they're popular, but really to understand what it means to be an American. So Indiana Jones, this is a jacket and hat used in The Last Crusade here. So, you know, he is this suave, handsome action hero, right? But he is also working to preserve cultural heritage, right? That's kind of his mission in life. And he's sort of a reluctant hero, right? In the course of trying to do his job, of trying to study world cultures, he's pulled into all these battles with authoritarian governments and the forces of evil. And he's this reluctant hero, kind of comes around to it. So for me, I kind of see World War II stories in this, right? That the United States didn't want to fight in World War II. We'd already been through a world war. We were, you know, struggling to get along. And here's this new international conflict. Well, we don't really want to fight that. But in the end, you know, Americans come in and save the day and stand up for the values that they believe in, right? So that's a story that I think George Lucas was very aware of, and Steven Spielberg, when they were making the Indiana Jones films. They talked about wanting to create new American fairy tales and new American heroes at a time when the United States had just been through a decade that was marked by riots and you know, racial strife and Watergate and Vietnam, all these things that had happened in the 1970s. American movies had changed. They had become less about, you know, triumphant heroes and more about internal angst and problems of society. And so they're asserting, well, here's a new American hero for this era where, you know, Ronald Reagan was saying it's morning in America, this optimistic time of recapturing something about that World War II generation of their values. So really, I think it's, you know, these objects that everybody wants to come and see because they're really fun, and this is something that we grew up watching or, you know, love this character. It actually can reveal a lot about the history of the era that it comes out, something about the, you know, what it means to be an American. We can read a lot into something as simple or sometimes seen as silly as like a leather jacket or a hat. So this is the basic premise of the entertainment collection that I work with. If a movie or a television show or a theatrical play is popular, or if it makes a lot of money in America, that usually means that it means something to somebody, right? It's not that it's, you know, we're living in an authoritarian government where you have to watch the thing that's being produced. Instead, it's a sort of democratic art, right? That entertainment is all about the marketplace, that you go to the things that have meaning to you. So one of the best examples of this is something I collected recently, this costume from Hamilton. You know, this show is all about the current conversations we're having about race and history and identity. And it happened to be a gigantic success, right? The play is, you know, up until recently was still very popular and charging very high ticket prices. The movie just premiered on Disney Plus, and the soundtrack has been incredibly successful. So we can see that this sometimes is driving the conversation or really contributing to the conversation, not just representing something that might have existed before. So one of the best things about the Smithsonian is that admission is free. You know, it's open to everybody. We get 4 to 5 million visitors a year just to my one museum. So that's really exciting, right? That we have this great opportunity to bring people in, and the popular culture stuff that I work with is very popular. So people want to come in and see it. They know we have the Ruby Slippers. They know that we have Indiana Jones and the Muppets. And so we have a real opportunity to kind of explore a little deeper. You know, if people are coming to see that already, well, let's talk about what it means. So that's my job. I love it. This is a stained glass window here from the RCA Victor plant in Camden, New Jersey, which if you've ever driven from the south into Philadelphia, at least I feel like I always see this, this big cathedral sort of to American culture that was there. It had this tower with these beautiful stained glass windows in them that were made by an immigrant Italian stained glass maker who had sort of trained in the cathedrals of Europe. And then he came and, you know, created this cathedral of commerce here, which is very cool. But this window has recently been restored, and it's the centerpiece of the third floor west wing of the museum, which is dedicated to American culture. So when you do come to the museum, hopefully in the next few years, there's going to be a big new exhibit here opening in 2022 that does exactly what I'm talking about tonight. It really looks at American culture and explores the history of that and how it shaped American history. It's going to be open for 20 years. So it's going to be seen by a lot of people. It's going to be one of the most popular exhibits on the mall, I think. And it's a really exciting opportunity. So the centerpiece of that exhibit, which will be on the side of this window, will be the Ruby Slippers. And that's what I'm here to talk to you tonight about. The slippers have been at the museum since 1979. And in all those years, if you add up how many people come to the museum every year, we know that they're among the most requested things that people want to see there. We estimate that over 100 million people have seen this pair of shoes, which is kind of insane. The anecdotes are always that we have to replace the carpet in front of where the Ruby Slippers are because there's so much foot traffic that people tread it up. And, whenever they're off display, which is very rarely, we always hear about it. That's people have made their pilgrimage to come and see the slippers. This is such an important thing. And so it's really quite a privilege and an honor, but also a great responsibility to us to talk about them and help people to understand them a little bit better. It's pretty rare in a museum these days to have something on kind of permanent display, just because we understand better now how environmental conditions can negatively impact something. You've seen if a shirt is hanging in a closet by a window for a year, it's going to be faded, right? That's what happens in a museum, even with controlled light, with UV coatings on cases like this one here. Light still damages things. The fluctuations in humidity and temperature can change things over time. And so things fade. Nothing's made to last forever, especially a prop or a costume that was made for a film. So we have to be really careful with these objects and make sure that we're taking good care of them. The Ruby Slippers are among the few that we really say are kind of on permanent display. If we took them off, people would be very angry with us. And we think as sort of a national treasure level item, this is something that people deserve to see, that it's their kind of right as a citizen to be able to come and see these Ruby Slippers. And the question that I get asked most often about the Ruby Slippers is, why do people still care about them? It's been 80 years since that movie came out. You can see here there are young people taking photos with their iPhones of the Ruby Slippers. There's no other movie from 1939, like Gone with the Wind or something like that, kids are posting about on Instagram. That's not very common. So it's something that I want to explore a little bit tonight, and I hope that we'll have some time for questions and comments so we could talk about it. Because I think it's something that really matters. An object, a pair of shoes, doesn't get imbued with that much magic and importance if it doesn't really resonate with people. So let's dive in and we'll kind of walk through some history to see if we can figure out what it is about the Ruby Slippers. As you all likely know, the story starts with L. Frank Baum. He was a writer and a salesman and sometimes an actor, but really he loved storytelling and spectacle, right? So those of you who have read the book know a lot about that, I think. But his history is really fascinating. He bred fancy chickens. He liked to set off elaborate 4th of July fireworks displays every year. And he became an expert on department store windows at a time that this was really interesting in American life. As there are department stores getting set up in American cities, you think about Macy's or some of these other large department stores, it's kind of a revolutionary thing that you can go and see all these goods displayed in these big plate glass windows. And so there's this really thriving industry of window dressers and people building displays in there. So Baum actually launched a magazine and wrote a book about this. And this one that you see here in the presentation is really cool. It's called The Vanishing Lady. This is something that he developed where a woman, a model, is wearing the newest fashions, and she's kind of obscured except for her bust and her head. And she's sort of modeling this thing, and people are trying to figure out what's going on. Why can you only see her head? And then she descends through an unseen elevator. She goes down beneath the stage, and she comes back up again after having changed, and she's wearing all new clothes. And can you imagine how exciting that would have been when you're walking through a city in like 1900 and you see that happen? This is something that could happen in the theater maybe, or on these new things called movies. But how can that happen just in a store window? So he's all about these special effects and lighting and mechanics and all the things you can do in a window. So you can see when he writes a book like The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, how he's kind of in that mindset of spectacle and theatricals, and is already thinking about what could happen with this book. Part of the deal with his publisher when he got the contract to write the book, because they were kind of worried about this book that was written for kids, maybe for families, is this really going to sell? Well, the theater was so important at this time and so profitable that in order to get the contract, he had to work with a local Chicago theater owner to say, well, within a few years, they're going to make a stage play of this. Maybe that'll help drive the sales. So already at the very beginning, he's thinking about how to turn this into something more. This book for kids is an outstanding success, right away. At this moment in American history, ideas about childhood are changing. This is the time when there's a movement against child labor. Victorian Americans are kind of seeing this, they're moving from an idea of childhood as like, children are here for useful labor on the farm, or maybe I can get them to sew together some clothes so we can make some more money. Well, now they're starting to think about children and childhood as a time of joy and of innocence. And especially for middle and upper class households, there's this world of goods that they can get for them, right? So toys and clothes and books and games. But children's literature still isn't a sure bet. So this was really a risk here. And when this book came out, and it was so imaginative, it had these great illustrations by W.W. Denslow. The fact that it was such a big hit was based on this visual culture that I think they were so aware of. And so, like I said, within a few years, in 1902, after the book was released in 1900, it was already a musical. And these are images from that first musical. Dorothy is looking a little bit more like a Ziegfeld Folly chorus girl in this, but otherwise I think the costumes are pretty similar to what you'd see, in all the other adaptations of the film over time, which is really cool. I think the Denslow drawings in there really helped to give this idea, from the beginning they understood that visual culture. The book was published in 1900 and it sold out of its run of 10,000 copies like immediately. It was really a sensation. So over the next 50 years, it sold 3 million more copies. And that's when it went out of copyright. So we don't even really know how many more have been sold today. But it's been translated into 50 different languages. Of course, Baum would go on and write 13 more books in the Oz series. So, it's very popular in that way. I often tell people that it's kind of like the Harry Potter series of its day, because these books would be released usually around the holidays, and there was such anticipation. There'd be articles in the newspaper about, oh, the new Oz book is coming out, y'all better get ready and put it on your Christmas list this year. And it was really, a fantastic success for so many years. But those of you who read the book know that it's a little bit different than what we know from the movie. It's a little bit more violent and scary in places, I think, and the Wicked Witch is trying to kill Dorothy and her friends all the time. I guess it happens in the movie too, but the interesting thing is that Baum thought that he was writing a story that was a little bit less violent than some of these traditional European fairy tales, like the Brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. So, he was more interested in these ideas of fantasy and adventure and the spectacle of it. But within a few years, obviously the books are a success, they're selling out, and then there's the musical. There are 3 different film adaptations in the silent film era of The Wizard of Oz. But he died in 1919, so you think that Oz mania started to die out maybe around that time, right? But the books actually remained bestsellers, and there were still rumblings of new adaptations of it. So if you think ahead to the late 1930s, when America is kind of coming out of the Great Depression, movies had been this form of escapism for people, I think, in this really tough time in American history. If you think about the Marx Brothers or about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, you know, these sort of spectacular films that take place in cool locations, they have beautiful costumes. And really this whole American industry grew up to create this, you know, dream factory to produce these. I believe that each of those words really matters in thinking about Hollywood in this period. It's a dream machine, but it's also a factory because the labor is so standardized and people are kind of churned through. But you know, one of the most successful films of this era has a lot in common with The Wizard of Oz that was originally, that would be released soon. That film is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was another huge financial risk, just like The Wizard of Oz, the book. This was Walt Disney's first full-length animated film, and it was the first that had been produced in the United States, really. It was extremely expensive, one of the most expensive movies ever made. At the time, it wasn't really known, the process of animation, you know, how to make that look elegant on a big screen for a full length. Maybe you'd have to animate it, you know, so many frames per second more than you would just for a short. So it's kind of over-engineered. They hired all these artists to work on it. The still that you see here, the cell, is actually from the museum's collection. We have a small animation collection that features some of the original cells used in the making of Snow White. But you know, the other thing was that not that many films were being marketed to children and to families at this time compared to romance and drama and comedy and all these other more adult films. So it was another big risk, you know, depending on children and families to see if they would come. But you know, the other thing about it that made it successful, because it was eventually a success and it kind of created the foundation for the Disney company and all the animated films that would follow, the thing that made it successful was color. And you know, it was combining color and sound. Both of those technologies had been around for a while, but were really brought into fantastic use in this film that was another extravagant spectacle that people really loved for those reasons. And, you know, movies had been hand colored as far back as the 1890s. A lot of silent movies were tinted. There was a lot of color in films. You know, if there's one thing that I want everybody to remember from this presentation is that The Wizard of Oz was not the first color film. But a lot of people remember it that way, and the kind of rumor has persisted because it, like Snow White, really used color to great effect. And part of the answer to that is Technicolor. This is the reason why we remember the color so much in these films. So Technicolor is this complicated process that you can see in this diagram, which is the simplest way I could find to represent it. It's still pretty complicated looking. It is a process that was developed over many years. By 1935, they had come up with this 3-strip process that used a specialized camera with a prism and colored filters to record the same movie 3 different times. So through these filters, they're running 3 strips of film. They get a cyan, a magenta, and a yellow layer, and then they process those different strips of film and use them to print with colored dyes onto another strip of film and create a color positive of the film that they're making. So you can imagine how complicated this is, how expensive it is, because you're running essentially 4 times as much film for every, you know, second of film that you're going to show. This is why there aren't a lot of color films before The Wizard of Oz, before Snow White, because it was so expensive and you're in the middle of the Great Depression. So it really set back the industry a while, accepting color, you know, color films being the standard. By the time you get to the 1950s, like here with Singing in the Rain, that's kind of remembered as this golden age of Technicolor with these really saturated hues. But the cool thing about Technicolor is that saturation that you see is due to the process. It wasn't just a color film that was run through the camera. You have these different black and white records. You know, this is a little bit confusing here to see these colored film strips, because what it's trying to show is just that those were what were used to print. In effect, what you have is just different black and white strips of film with the color information removed that you then use to print again, which is all just to say that Technicolor doesn't fade. You have all that information saved and you can still print beautiful, saturated, crazy colors like this, no matter when you want to watch the film. So you have to use a specialized camera to do Technicolor, of course, and this is one that's in our collection, this big giant camera here. It has to be big because you're running 3 different strips of film through at the same time. And the thing that's around, you can see there's a window into the actual camera, but the thing around it was a sound blimp, because the camera was so loud that if you're recording in sound, you actually need something to soundproof it and keep it contained. And this thing was so big, I wish I could tell you the exact proportions. It's basically like 4 feet by 4 feet or something like that. But people who worked on films at the time called that the Enchanted Cottage, just because it was so big in itself that it looked like a little building that they were rolling around. So you had to use these special Technicolor cameras that you had to lease from the company. You had to get Technicolor consultants to come and help you with it. You had to use way more light than you would in an ordinary film because you're filming through these colored filters. So you have to get all these really expensive and hot Klieg lights that would, be all over the stage. And during the filming of a movie like The Wizard of Oz, it was regularly over 100 degrees on the set, with people wearing these big elaborate costumes, like the Cowardly Lion costume made of real lion fur. You can imagine how awful it was. They actually had to, on the set of Munchkinland, where there were thatched roofs, they had a fire warden there at all times because it was so hot that they were worried that the huts were going to catch on fire in Munchkinland. So it's this huge, complicated process. And you're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars to make a film. This is not a simple thing. So, Snow White, in its success, proved that you could do something like this. It was the smash hit of 1937. It was a film that showed that you could market a film to young people and have it be a success. You could have a young female protagonist. That was something that was unusual for the time, especially for kind of an adventure film like this. And so MGM, which is the leading studio at the time, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, is looking at this Disney success and thinking, okay, maybe we can make something like this. Studios are always kind of chasing the popular idea at any given time. So thinking, okay, maybe we can repeat the success of Snow White and make our own sort of fantastic musical for kids. And maybe it could star a young woman that's on an adventure. Maybe it'll have a lot of colorful special effects and that sort of thing. Lots of fun, popular songs, maybe even some lovable, funny little people in it. You can see kind of what they're thinking. The cogs are turning here about, I remember The Wizard of Oz, let's make that. It had been made, like I said, already 3 times before in silent films, and there were, constant stage productions of it. So it was never really out of the public eye. But MGM decided to take a risk on it and put everything they had into making this movie in 1939. As they were looking at the slate of films that were coming out, this was an incredible year for film in 1939. You have Gone with the Wind, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stagecoach, Gunga Din, The Women. You could just go on and on with this list of films in 1939. And they're like, we have to try to find an audience, that we can call our own, and we're going to do it with this. So they hired this incredible cast of some of the best known actors in the business. Burt Lahr, Jack Haley, Ray Bolger were all well-known vaudeville actors. That would be this great ensemble cast. They did this, big casting call to try to cast Dorothy. Shirley Temple was in the running, but she lost out to Judy Garland because they thought Judy Garland could sing better. So there's this really interesting story of the making of the film. They put all these studio resources into making this movie, right? So these songs are written by Yip Harburg and Harold Allen, who are just some of the greatest songwriters of the musical era. There were at least 20 different people who worked on the script, including some of the greatest writers that the studio employed. There would be filming on the largest soundstage on the lot, to build these gigantic sets for like the Yellow Brick Road and the Munchkinland Village. There were new makeup effects that were created for the Scarecrow's makeup, which was all prosthetics. It was not a mask. And new techniques for special effects, like the tornado that was done this really ingenious way with women's stockings to make it look like the cyclone rolling through. And then, most importantly, the studio's top costume designer, this legend named Gilbert Adrian, was brought in to do the costumes for the film. And so he's tasked with creating costumes just as spectacular as anything else that's going to be done in the making of the movie. So to get back to the shoes, I'm sure that some of you have looked this up because if you're curious and love books, you must have realized, wait, they're not silver like in the book. In the movie, they're ruby, right? So the answer to that question is Technicolor, right? If you're spending all this money on Technicolor, why would you make silver shoes on a Yellow Brick Road? They're not going to look that great on screen when you could do something that would really pop, right? You've already got the Emerald City, you've got these beautiful costumes, you've got, you have to have something that's really going to sparkle and look incredible, and yellow and red look good together. So let's go with ruby slippers. And a copy of the script exists where they've still said silver shoes throughout, and somebody's crossed out and written Ruby above it, which is a really cool artifact of the making of the Wizard of Oz. But again, we're talking about ruby slippers. These aren't the ruby slippers that you know from the film, right? Well, as they're kind of figuring out what they want to do, they started testing out this pair that's called the Arabian pair of slippers. You can see Judy Garland modeling them here in the test shots. They thought, okay, if we're going all out, let's make these shoes look really spectacular, right? They should be memorable and exotic and crazy looking. Well, after coming up with this design for the shoes with the curled toe, the sort of Arabian styling and lots of gems on them, the film's director, Victor Fleming, saw this and he said, no, I don't know. Let's go with something a little more classic, a little more befitting this Kansas farm girl. There's something, let's redesign them to look a little bit more usual. Well, here we go. These are the shoes that we all know and love, right? The interesting thing is these are just off the rack shoes. So I think Adrian took that to heart. He was like, okay, fine. If you want regular shoes, I'll go buy some shoes. People have said they probably cost maybe $11 at the time. They were by the Innis Shoe Company. They were just white pumps and they were dyed red. There was a silk layer, a red silk that sequins were sewn to. And then that was attached over the top. These bows were made. I'll walk you through some of the construction of the slippers because I've stolen some of these slides from the museum's conservator, Don Wallace, who did all the work on our slippers recently to kind of understand their construction a little bit better. So you can see that this is the sort of silk faille that had the sequin sewn to it, and that was applied over the top of the dyed shoe. These are some high resolution photographs taken actually with a microscope showing how this was attached and seeing some of the threads that the sequins are attached with. So these are very cool. And then these are the bows, which are actually made of a buckram fabric and attached. And the bottom of the shoes have some felt attached to them, which is a very cool little bit of trivia. This is so that when Judy Garland was dancing and walking down the yellow brick road, there wouldn't have been the sort of clack clack on the road, the sound from her heels and from the sole of the shoe, because the yellow brick road was actually just made out of wood, like plywood. So it actually would have been pretty noisy, especially in some of the quieter moments of her walking down the road if they hadn't put this felt on the bottom of the shoes. So there's some really cool stuff that we've learned about the construction of our shoes in this project that we've been working on. As you can see that the slippers are a little bit darker than you might expect, right? They look darker than on the side here. I'll get into some of the specifics of that a little bit later, but one of the main reasons why is, again, Technicolor. When you've got this much light on something, it has to be a little bit darker in order to look like the color you want it to be. We've kind of determined that this is probably the color that the shoes were, pretty close to it to begin with. In order to make them look sparkly and ruby, you need them to be kind of a burgundy color. So as with any film, several pairs of ruby slippers were made, but the exact number of this is unknown. I'm going to get into this story, but we do know that there are at least 4 pairs of similar looking ruby slippers that are out there in the world right now. These are the Arabian shoes, so we know that those exist. And there's also another test pair that's covered entirely in bugle beads, not in the sequins. So that's out there too. This is a pair that was awarded in 1939 to a high school student who entered a contest to pick the best movie of 1939. She got a pair of ruby slippers. These were hidden away in her closet for many years, and it wasn't known until the 1970s that she still had them. So it's a really fun and interesting story. There is this pair, which was owned by an individual, which I'm going to discuss at length in a little bit. This pair made a lot of news as having been stolen from the Judy Garland Museum in 2005. This pair is owned by the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles. It is often called the witch's shoes because these do not have felt on the bottom of them. And it's thought that there's a scene where the house falls on the witch and you can see the bottoms of the shoes, right? Because her feet are sticking out underneath. So they wouldn't have wanted to have the felt visible there. You'd want to just see the red soles of the shoes. So that's the idea of these being called the witch's pair. And then finally, the pair that's in the American History Museum. So this is where the story gets interesting with our pair of the ruby slippers. After the production of the film Wraps in 1939, the costumes were just set aside. This was standard studio practice. They're thinking, okay, maybe we can use these again. I think the Glinda costume had been used in another film and would be used again. For instance, they would modify these costumes and, just keep them on the lot. It's cheaper than having to make everything from scratch. So it was thought, maybe we'll hold on to them. Maybe there'll be a sequel. I don't know. There are a lot of Oz books. We'll see how this goes, right? So they were put aside, and we really have no record of the ruby slippers for the next over 30 years. What happens next is MGM organizes an auction in 1970. The movie business is changing. There's a lot of independent production, a lot of things being done on location. The studios have lost power. They're not really the big machines for making movies anymore. And MGM starts to transition away from doing anything on its back lot. That land is very expensive now. They're in Culver City, and they want to redevelop that, sell it off, and find new ways to make money. MGM Grand Casinos, you've heard about that. There's a lot of corporate takeovers happening at the time. So in any case, they decide we're just going to sell off all this old stuff. There's no use for it. There's no value to any of these old costumes that are just, taking up space on our backlot here. Nobody really believed that there was a market or value for historic movie memorabilia. So this is before the Smithsonian started to collect this stuff. This is before it was seen as being as valuable as some of the other things that I talked to you about, Abraham Lincoln's hat, George Washington's uniform. We can all agree that those are important things to keep. But the ruby slippers, they were in a movie, right? Who cares? That was the idea. That's what MGM thought. They decided to have this auction, and they thought the only thing that might have value here that they have kept for all these years was some of the antique furniture that they bought for movies like Marie Antoinette, right? That had great French furniture. So they organized this auction with David Weiss, who you see the auction catalogs here. He was an antiques dealer. And they thought, okay, well, he'll put this together. We'll see what we can get, right? So luckily for us who love movies and who love history, he hired a guy named Kent Warner, who was a Hollywood costumer and a lover of great movies himself. And he believed in the value of these things. He organized the auction beautifully. You can see in this photo here, the way that he arranged the costumes and showed them off as objects of art, not just as old pieces of clothing that were stuck in a warehouse for 40 years. Instead, he really believed that people would care about this stuff, that it mattered in Americans' lives. So the interesting thing is that he was told, as this sort of started to gain traction and the media was covering this upcoming auction, they said, what's probably going to go for the most money? The ruby slippers, because everybody remembers the ruby slippers. So why don't you go and find the ruby slippers, and we'll put them, on a special cushion and display them in this way that, at the auction is going to be so important. So he went back to find the ruby slippers. Well, he was probably the only one who really understood that there were going to be multiple pairs of the slippers there. But he brought out a pair of ruby slippers and said, here are the ruby slippers. And they were sold at auction for $15,000. Nobody believed anything was going to go for that much money. The only other thing that sold for that much was the entire boat from Showboat, that movie. That boat sold for $15,000 and this pair of shoes. So this really shocked the world, that got all this media attention, and it helped to create the memorabilia market that we have today, that people do think about Hollywood costumes and the value of them and the importance of them. So what happened to the other pairs, right? We know that he went back and found multiple other pairs. Well, he held on to them as best we can tell. And Kent Warner died relatively young. He was a casualty of the AIDS crisis. And so we don't have him here to talk to him about what happened or where those pairs went. But we think, as I began to lay out, we know where all these different pairs of slippers went, and they each tell their own interesting story. The Arabian test pair was sold to Debbie Reynolds, for instance. She was very interested in that pair. She believed, and no one knows if this is really true, that Judy Garland thought that was the pair that they should have used, that she was especially attached to them. And Debbie Reynolds, for many years, was trying to set up a Hollywood costume museum, so that would have been the centerpiece of her museum. Some of the other pairs, went to individuals. He may have kept the best looking pair for himself, the pair that's now owned by the Academy Museum, because it was known that he had a pair in his apartment for many years. But obviously the value of these things became very known. And so he, wanted to make sure that they got out to people who would care for them and weren't just looking for the money. So one of his friends and another person who believed in the power of Hollywood costume was a man named Michael Shaw. And he sold him a pair. Michael Shaw says he bought them for $2,500 at the time, which would have been a great deal. He obviously believed that he was going to care for them if, the other pair had sold for $15,000. But Michael was a movie buff and a collector. He also owns one of Judy Garland's gingham dresses. I've met with him. He's still around and has an incredible collection of Hollywood memorabilia in his house, if it's all to be believed that it's real. I'm not really sure. I got to hold a Maltese Falcon, so if that's real, then I'm very excited, but it's kind of hard to say. But Michael, being a movie buff, wanted to share his ruby slippers with the public. So he organized a tour throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s where he would take the slippers around, sometimes charge admission or just, try to recoup some of his travel costs. But he took them to libraries and shopping centers and things like that and wanted to share the ruby slippers with people who loved it. In 2005, they were on loan to the Judy Garland Museum, which is a small museum that's in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And one morning in August of 2005, the staff came into the museum, found that the back door had been broken into, the security camera had been disabled, the plexiglass case that was holding the ruby slippers had been shattered, and there was a single sequin left on the pedestal, and the slippers were gone. So of course you can imagine, especially as the other pairs of ruby slippers had sold at auction in years around this for up to $1 million, this was huge news, right? That the ruby slippers had been stolen. It kind of exposed a lot of people for the first time to this idea that now that they know that there are other pairs of ruby slippers, which, I think only increases people's interest in coming to see the pair at the museum. So that's really cool too. What was not cool was that this pair of slippers was stolen. And so the FBI was called in, the local police department was dragged through the mud in the press for allowing this, obviously the director of the museum to allow the security to be so lax. And Michael Shaw, I know, is heartbroken because I've talked to him about this, and this was a horrible moment in his life. The FBI investigated, they chased every lead, they dusted for fingerprints, they even dove into a flooded quarry that was nearby, that there were rumors that the ruby slippers had been placed in a paint can and dropped into this. There's a really fascinating episode of the show Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates, where he chases down some of these leads with the FBI agents. And so I recommend that to you if you want to find out more about this whole saga of trying to find the ruby slippers. But poor Michael Shaw, who's heartbroken about this, got the insurance payout and doesn't own his slippers anymore. So the case kind of went cold, right? This is something that he was heartbroken that nothing came out about. But if we fast forward to 2016, the Smithsonian's pair of ruby slippers has been on display continuously since 1979, as I said, and all these millions of people have come to see it. And all those effects of the environmental conditions have started to take their toll on the slippers. We think, again, since they've been on display so long, we haven't had the time to study them as in depth as we would for other objects that are coming in. There are people at the museum who are called conservators, and they are material scientists who study how things are made, the materials they're made out of, the changes that happen to them over time, the effects of light and these environmental conditions. And then they treat them and try to do not restoration, which would involve adding new things to historic objects, but they do conservation, which is trying to stabilize, clean, and preserve for the future. So they took a cursory look at the ruby slippers, and you can see from this infographic I have up here, there were some real concerns about the condition that they were in and what was going to happen. Were they fading? Were these marks and scratches that were everywhere on them from the making of the film? Or is this something that's happened at the museum since? Were the sequins going to start falling off? We didn't know. So the museum made a decision, even though this was really difficult, that we were going to take the ruby slippers off of view for 2 years. We were going to study them and try to raise the money to do the really in-depth work, the research and the conservation work that we need to do in order to make sure that they would survive for future generations to see here at the museum. So, the Smithsonian's really lucky that we get this federal appropriation every year that covers our basic operating expenses. So it keeps the buildings running, it pays most of our salaries. But for anything extraordinary like building a new exhibit, for this kind of conservation work, we have to seek outside funding. So, ordinarily we go to corporations or wealthy individuals and ask for this money, and we had some offers of those things, but we decided that with these objects that were so beloved by so many members of the public, we were going to do something different. We thought that this project was going to cost around $300,000 to really do it the right way, from hiring the world experts to building this new state-of-the-art case to hold them. And so we decided to go to Kickstarter. And I don't know if anybody, caught this. I'm sure if you're a Wizard of Oz fan or Ruby Slippers fan, you might have paid more attention to this. But in 2016, we had this Kickstarter project. We went out and said, we want to raise $300,000. You can donate as little as $1 or up to $10,000. own your piece of the Ruby slippers, help us to keep them Ruby. And there were rewards, you could get your custom tote bag, or you could get online access to the conservation lab as the work was being done, or you could even have lunch with the curator. So I was taking people around, I took them on tours and had lunch with them, which was a really cool experience to get to meet people who care so much about the slippers. And we made some great friends through that. We reached our goal of $300,000 in 1 week. So it really was this incredible moment to know how much the slippers really matter to people. Over 6,000 donors from over 40 countries around the world, all of them pitching in what they could. And it was just so cool because it gave us this opportunity to really talk about how we care for things, the fact that, objects do decay over time, and what does the museum do to stop that? How do we interpret them? So right away, we started to learn more about the slippers. We took them off display. Don Wallace, my friend and conservator at the museum, started to study them. We had always suspected this, but now we confirmed that the slippers in our care were from 2 different pairs of shoes. The reason behind this is not really known. It could be that Judy Garland had different sized feet, because one's a little bit narrower, they're size 5, so one is a size 5B and one is a size 5C. So they're only slightly different, but I mean, obviously they were constructed that way, they were sold that way. So maybe one foot got swollen during filming, she's still a growing girl at 16 years old at this time. But one of the things that we kind of discounted as we started to do more research was that this is just something that Kent Warner did when he was grabbing pairs of shoes from the old warehouse where they were, that he might have just grabbed 2 different shoes. We actually were able to do some high resolution stills of the film. We did really in-depth analysis and found that it looks like she's wearing 2 different shoes in some of the scenes, because you can see that the heel of the left shoe is more slender than the right here. These are actually different shoes, not just mismatched pairs. And so we were able to see that in the film. And then you can see that there's actually the left shoe is painted red and there was never a heel cap, as compared to the one on the right. So this is a really interesting moment of analysis too, that we see that these are different shoes. On the interior panel, you can see this too. When you come to the museum, the label asks you to see if you can find the differences between the shoes. So when you guys come to the museum someday, you're going to be way ahead of the rest of the visitors who are there looking at these. But you can see that this heel grip is a different shape in there, right? There's also different manufacturer's markings in here. There's the size differences noted, and you can see that the right shoe is designated number 1 Judy Garland, the left says number 6. So that helps us to think that, okay, these are from the number 1 and the number 6 pair of shoes as they were making these during the movie. So it's a really cool thing. It's total trivia, but it helps us to understand a little bit about the making of the film, right? That maybe they had a lot of different pairs of shoes on hand when it began because they knew, some of the things about making a movie with a growing girl or about, intense dancing, what could happen. You can also see in this image, I love some of the damage on the shoe where some of the sequins are missing at the front, probably from her, kicking things accidentally as she's dancing in the shoes. So, we started to learn a little bit about where the wear patterns were and that sort of thing, the condition from use. There's slight differences in the bow here. I mean, we can get really in depth with all this stuff, which I won't go totally into. But, we have the world's expert in ruby slippers now, which is really great at the museum. Don was able to go over every single sequin. She called it a sequin by sequin sequence in order to go through and clean each sequin with a Q-tip and reposition them all using Teflon coated tweezers. And then to study each individual stone that's in the shoes too. So this is one of the real important takeaways of the entire project, was that there were repairs being done to the shoes during the filming of the movie. Obviously things were falling off and, it was rough and tumble filming for a long time with all this heat and action, everything happening. So this is where one of the original stones of the shoe's bow has fallen out, and it was replaced not with a red stone like the rest of them, but with a clear stone that was painted red, probably on set. They just needed to do this quickly and they thought nobody's ever going to notice this, let's just paint it red. So it was one of those things that really marked this as an interesting moment, an authentic piece of movie history to find out something about the making of the film. And it's going to be important later on. So here's Dawn, some of the work that she did to reposition all the sequins. You can tell the difference. There's a little bit of differential fading here on the sequins, based on the fading over time. And she figured out the substratas of the layers of the sequins that were made. This is really nerdy stuff, but it's really helped us to understand over time what's happened to the sequins. And the coolest part about this to me is that we found out that the sequins had all been electroplated with silver so that they would shine even more under all the lights for Technicolor. So that's what makes them kind of so sparkly. So that's another cool bit of trivia for you. So like I said, Dawn studied them. This is her here under the microscope. She treated, it doesn't look like a lot from the untrained eye here, but when you look at it under a microscope, it is really heads and tails different here. It really helped improve these for their long-term care. So now we know so much more about the slippers. They have been studied. There have been papers given at conservation conferences about the ruby slippers. All of this cleaning makes sure that they will stay ruby for generations to come. All the sequins are realigned, for instance, so that there's not any kind of, it's not going to be pulling on this really fragile thread, so that sequins could continue to pop off. And then the best part of it for me and for most visitors is that they're now back on display. We're able to reopen this beautiful gallery just dedicated to the ruby slippers. This is on that Hall of American Culture at the museum. You can see there's a curtain motif. We painted this really cool mural around there with some of the phrases from the film, and the poppies everywhere. But the idea of this is just to give people this opportunity to come and have their pilgrimage with the slippers, to make sure that they're going to be, in the best condition forever. This graph that's on the right shows how we were able to balance the temperature and relative humidity in this case. It's really a state-of-the-art space-age case that controls every aspect of the environment in there, so that all of the materials that they're made out of will be at the sort of optimal temperature and humidity. But then, you also see some of the reason that the slippers matter in these phrases that are on the wall, right? There's no place like home. I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. These are things that have transcended the film to become phrases that we talk about in politics and society and with our families. It really shows the impact of the film beyond just the sort of, glamour of it. It's become part of the fabric of everyday life. So I really love this simple gallery, but it also is big enough to accommodate the crowds that want to come and see them now that they're back on display. The designer of the gallery said he wanted it to be big enough that he could drive his Mini Cooper around to the ruby slippers, which I think it is, so that's pretty cool. So here's where things get really interesting, and the saga comes back. So in the summer of 2018, as we're finishing up this conservation project, getting the slippers ready to put back on view, Dawn and I were summoned down to the museum's basement to meet with members of the FBI's art crime team. They had recovered a pair of ruby slippers related to the theft in 2005, and they wanted us to help to investigate, to authenticate the slippers and see if they were a real pair. So Dawn and I, in the course of this project, we'd done this media blitz for the Kickstarter and everything. We were getting people contacting us all the time saying, I've got a pair of ruby slippers. And ordinarily we could tell right away, those aren't real. Sometimes they had great stories to them. And people obviously really believe that they had them. Only a few cases that somebody was probably a scammer and thinks that you make some money off of something. But there are only a few really authentic pairs of ruby slippers in the world. So Dawn and I, being sort of all studied up on the ruby slippers, agreed to help out. This is something that I never thought I'd do as a Smithsonian curator, but we had this really cool opportunity to help with the FBI. So we wanted to help. And Dawn was able to study the pairs and make a pretty reasonable authentication call. Not only were these an authentic pair of ruby slippers used in the making of the film, they were the reciprocal pair to the mismatched pair that we had. So here you can see the pairs reunited. You look at the heel grips and you can tell this was the number 6 and the number 1 to our number 1 and number 6 pair of ruby slippers. So they were reunited for the first time probably since Kent Warner pulled them out of the costume shop at MGM in 1970. Together at last, these pairs are reunited. And the real smoking gun that we were able to prove that these were an authentic pair was that we found a little clear gem in the bow that had been painted red, just like the one that we found on our pair of shoes. This is something that had never been publicly acknowledged or spoken about because we were still, writing the papers and everything about this. So the most skilled the most skilled forger of ruby slippers in the world wouldn't know to have that little detail because nobody ever knew that they would do something like that. But it being from the same era, from the same production, obviously the techniques would have been the same of trying to do a repair on the fly for the ruby slippers. So, with fanfare, the FBI announced that they had recovered the pair of ruby slippers. We, got to see them, work with them, but they're now back in evidence. They're still pursuing this case. We are dying to hear the final outcome of the story. We were told that there was a sting operation. We know that much, that there were some people trying to extort the insurance company for the money that had been paid out for the slippers if they could return them. And the FBI worked with the insurance company to create this sting at the diner and come in and swoop in and get the slippers. So that was really a cool moment. I can't wait to see it on film, you know, when this whole thing has been turned into a movie someday. But it's really a cool story and something that's really exciting to be a part of. I think, you know, even their theft proves the power of the ruby slippers and their importance to people in an everyday way. You know, the slippers have a variety of meanings, I think, to people. To me, I love them most because they're such a representation of the power of Hollywood, you know, that this industry emerged and it was a uniquely American thing, that they've inspired so many people for so many decades. And continue to today. But I know that they have a variety of meanings to people, right? The gay community, you know, for many years in the 70s and 80s identified themselves as friends of Dorothy because there was something about this movie and about this young girl's search for home and for friendship in a world that didn't make sense to her and didn't acknowledge her or respect her. Something about that appealed to the members of the gay community. You know, there are a lot of people who are into this because they just love fashion, right? And they think these slippers are fabulous and fantastic. You know, there are people who just remember watching the movie as kids and the power that it had to them, maybe cherish memories with family around the holidays, you know, when it would play reruns. So in any case, you know, the slippers I think are part of American identity now. And I love that it's just this open question that we can all continue to debate. And as long as I'm curator at the museum, these will be on display and we'll have a place that we can talk about the power of movies in American life. So anyway, I want to open it up now and hear what you all have to say. Elizabeth, I think you're muted over there.
Thank you. Thank you. So I've been looking at the comments and I know there's a little bit of a lag to the live to Facebook. So we will let people start getting in some more comments here at the end. But I do have a couple questions here. Somebody was very interested in that Arabian pair in particular. She said that they should have been the pair that was chosen, but she was very glad that Debbie Reynolds had such interest in them and keeping those alive. But she's wondering, do you know where those are now?
That is a great question and a very unfortunate thing that I don't, because Debbie Reynolds had amassed this incredible collection. She almost drove herself bankrupt many times collecting Hollywood costumes. She, at one point, was living in a car, supposedly because she'd spent so much money to help bring this collection together and could never really get the museum on its feet that she hoped to create. Throughout the 80s and 90s, she was trying really hard to gather together this collection and to find a home for it. And in the end, she was unsuccessful. And it was in the mid 2000s, maybe early 2000s, there was an auction organized. She needed the money in order to keep living and sold off this incredible collection. And it didn't go to a single person. It went to many different bidders. And the Arabian pair, as far as I know, it's never been revealed who purchased them. So my best guess would be that it's a private collector somewhere who is treasuring those and they're in their house. But it's a real reminder to me that when this Hollywood history is out there, we have to do our best to try to preserve it and find a way to bring it into public institutions where people can enjoy it. So unfortunately, I don't know.
All right, thank you. We have one more question that came through during your presentation, which is that specifically about the felt on the bottom of the slippers. And I loved hearing that part about the witch's pair. I'd never heard that before, and that makes total sense. I love that anecdote. But in terms of the pairs that that Judy Garland was wearing, the question is basically that it's understood that that would help with noise, but couldn't felt on the bottom of the shoes be slippery, and they wouldn't want to have their leading lady fall down on set. So
Great point. Yes. I don't know personally of any story that involved that, but I've always wondered about that too. That could have been a risk. You make a great point in asking that question about the leading lady, wanting to make sure that she wouldn't get hurt. I think that's probably what the studio, if they cared at all, that's probably all they cared about. There are a lot of stories, if you read about the making of The Wizard of Oz, about how horribly the actors were treated. Judy Garland herself was kind of bossed around by people. She was made to take diet pills. She was kept on a diet of caffeine and, allowed only a little bit of time to continue studying as a girl who's a high school student, to try to, continue her studies. And one of the most horrific stories of the making that involves people being at risk was about Buddy Ebsen, who is best known for playing Jed Clampett on the Beverly Hillbillies, but he was originally cast to play the Tin Man. And he was a well-known actor, dancer, singer at the time, was in a lot of musicals in the 1930s and was sort of an obvious choice to be in the movie because he was so popular. But in the early filming, they were actually applying aluminum powder directly to his face. And he started to develop a cough, started to feel really ill, and was taken to the hospital, and his lungs had collapsed from breathing in the aluminum dust. And they had to recast the part. He was in the hospital and, barely survived by all accounts. And when he came back out and tried to, kind of get them to change their working standards and, maybe cast him in another film, the studio said, you know what, this is your problem. And he was blacklisted from film, which really hurt his career. And he ended up working in television basically because his film career had died off from, being a troublemaker during the making of The Wizard of Oz. So Hollywood studios were not nice and, mainly cared about the bottom line. And so that's a great question. And I wonder how careful Judy had to be, dancing in those shoes, wondering about if she was going to slip.
Yeah, and Margaret Hamilton also had a really bad time of it as the Wicked Witch, right? Because I've read so
Yes.
much
Yeah.
about the film at this point, and she got pretty badly burned in a stunt, and I think she was out of commission for like 3 months or something.
Mm-hmm. And she also said that the makeup, which was comprised partially of like verdigris and was removed
Yes.
acetate and stuff, it permanently cast her skin green in places. So it was a kind of a cursed production in some ways.
Right. Now I know we have more comments coming in here, so somebody was wondering if the Smithsonian is open now, and we had talked about that before the presentation started. Obviously you're not at the Smithsonian right now.
Yes.
So what can you tell people, for the future who want to visit and see the slippers?
So yeah, the museums have been closed since mid-March, and we've all been working from home and trying to find ways to reach out to the public and still keep sharing everything our research and our collections. But unfortunately, we don't have a clear plan yet for reopening. There are some guidelines that we want to meet in terms of the pandemic and making sure that everybody stays safe. And we're aiming to get open as soon as possible, and we can do that safely. So I would say keep paying attention to the museum social media, the Smithsonian's accounts, to find out the latest on that. Tomorrow actually, the first Smithsonian museum are reopening. The Air and Space Museum Annex at the Udvar-Hazy facility near Dulles, Virginia is opening, and the National Zoo is reopening because it's outside, and we feel that we can do that safely. So there is a plan, and we're starting to kind of phase it in. But if you're planning to come to DC anytime soon, I'm sorry that you won't be able to see the slippers.
All right. We have a question here about once the FBI case finishes, will the Smithsonian try to display a matched pair?
That's a great question too. We've gotten that many times, and so first of all, we wouldn't unmatch our pair because the historic information that we know about the slippers is important. That they were used in this way, that we could tell from the film that she was wearing the mismatched shoes during the filming. So there's an important record there, and of course, them having come to us that way, that's important to keep them together. But we would, of course, love to display them together. And if there's any opportunity to do that, I think it would be really neat, and to tell the story of this whole saga in person at the museum. As I understand, the shoes are still in evidence and are technically owned by the insurance company now because they paid out Michael Shaw the amount in his insurance policy. The recent conversations I've had with him personally, he would love to get them back and has considered ways that he could maybe, get back his ownership of the slippers and continue to share them with people. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it all plays out. And like I said, I'm just dying to hear the full story once, they can be brought to trial.
Right. So another question. I understand choosing red because of Technicolor, but in addition, did the gem ruby have any particular connotations in popular imagination during the 1930s?
Wow, good question. That's something I want to research more. I'd never considered that before. I would love to know. One of the things I didn't bring up, but you may have discussed or read about, those of you who read the book, was this theory that came out in the 1960s about the book and the movie, referencing these contemporary debates around 1900 about bimetallism in the United States. That was an entire presidential campaign around 1900 that focused on the idea of leaving the gold standard for the silver standard in terms of the currency, and how that was tied up with all of these other political debates about the power base of parties, being West Coast or East Coast, and what it was going to mean for inflation and for farmers and for bankers and industry. And as far as we all know, historians, Frank Baum never wrote about this or said explicitly that he had written this book in reference to it, but a very convincing case was made in the 1960s by an amateur historian saying the book kind of lines up directly with these debates that were happening at that time, that the yellow brick road represents gold, that the silver shoes represent silver, that there are all these references to farmers via the scarecrow or industry via the tin man that would line up with the way that people talked about that debate at the time. So it's unclear if that debate really had much to do with the book. But I would love to know if there was some greater significance to rubies in the 1920s. That's a really good question.
All right. Somebody's wondering about how the shoes got from the studio to auction. And that process.
Yeah, so the auction was actually organized on the grounds of the studio, on the back lot. So there's some great photos. I should have included one in the presentation of one of the sound stages actually set up with all the chairs there, and people, they set up a stage to put all these things out on display. That photo you saw of Ken Warner holding the shoes, I think, was actually in one of the sound stages that The Wizard of Oz was filmed in, which must have been a very weird experience. But Ken Warner says that there was a costume, the ladies' wardrobe costume shop, something like that, was in like an old barn on the back lot. And he was looking there because he knew that must be where the ruby slippers were. And there's this apocryphal story about him like climbing a ladder into a loft and seeing a single beam of light coming down and catching one of the sequins from the ruby slippers, on a shelf, and he was able to go and find them, which is a very romantic and cool story. And who knows if it actually happened that way, but as we know, that there's not really much information about how many pairs he found or what condition they were in. He was told if there were more than one pair of slippers, he should destroy them. And so in taking away those other pairs, he saved them. But the basic thing about, bringing the shoes out and putting them on display for the auction was actually pretty simple.
Great. Those are all the questions I have so far coming through, I think. So I know there's a bit of a lag, but if anybody has any other questions for Ryan about the saga of the ruby slippers, just go ahead and put them in the comments now. One last chance here for some questions. All right. Well, I think that's it in terms of the questions I have seen come through. But Ryan, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I hope everybody enjoyed reading the book, watching the movie again. thinking about the ruby slippers and all these really cool entertainment artifacts that you talked about as well. So thank you all for watching. Thank you again, Ryan. Thank you to Jennifer, our technology librarian, for helping me with this. And we hope you all have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.